Okay, so uh, this is Bob Fornell. I'm here with Lewis. He'll introduce himself in a bit. We're going to be chatting about interviewee to interviewer. So some of my experiences as an interviewee, and eventually to where I'm at now, where I've been interviewing for a number of years. I'm not a full-time interviewer. I'm a developer. I interview as my company needs. I'll be honest, this is a second take on this. We weren't even going to try a second take, but I do have a 2-year-old daughter running around the house. Hopefully, you won't hear her too much in this talk. She was screaming loud enough we had to stop and restart. So here we go. Let's jump into this, okay? As I said, I'm Bob Fornell, husband and father, clearly. This talk has evolved from having coffee chats with literally hundreds of 100 Dev cohort members, online boot camp. Through those conversations, we talked a lot about my background. I've talked a lot about my background, in pieces here and there. We're trying to collect that together here. The number one factor in most of my interviewing over the years, was having a major stubborn streak, switching from job to job. I had wonderful advice from some amazing people, and more often than not, I tried to figure out how to do things myself. I've worked with horrible companies, and Lewis actually asked, as we were prepping for this talk, what I meant by horrible companies. I even worked for a company years and years and years ago. Right? This was pretty close to right out of college. The owner of the company was buying hardware out of a van late at night. About a year after I left, the building burned down, and the owner of the company went to jail for arson. So when I say horrible companies, I mean I've worked for some pretty bad ones out there. I've worked for good companies too, and everything in between. I've done work I loved, I've done work I hated, and it wasn't until the company I'm at, and this is like 38 plus years in the industry, did I find a company where I love what I'm doing, I love where I work, I thoroughly enjoy the people I work with, and I'm very, very happy. And part of what I'm doing these videos for is to hopefully shorten that up for you, okay? I think Lewis is trying to take advantage of some of that, find the right company, the right work, without having spent 38 years to get there, okay? So here I'll let Lewis introduce himself to you.
Hey, how's it going, everybody? My name is Lewis. I'm a software engineer at 100 Devs, and I've always loved math. I've always loved finance, and I always wasn't into tech at first, until I built my first PC using the bank money that I was receiving from, and then I would just start buying parts and whatnot. And then I noticed that I was really into it once I started troubleshooting my computer and whatnot. So I decided that I wanted to not do finance anymore and wanted to get into tech. But I didn't exactly know how to do it. So one of the main things that I found that you can learn about tech is C programming, and I tried it out. Didn't like it. Wasn't fun. Maybe it was the resource I was using. So then I tried doing something more fun on paper, like cybersecurity. Didn't like that either. It wasn't that great. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. At the end of the day, I started watching my girlfriend code and whatnot, and it looked really fun. And so I decided to do that too. And here I am now. Fast forward a couple months later, here I am now.
All right, so let's jump into the meat of this. As an interviewee, okay, I spent 32 plus years in the workforce, company to company, interviewing, multiple dozens of times. Some of the takeaways, one of my first jobs working in corrections, I actually had a family friend who called me and asked me if I wanted to take that job in corrections. And I think that's the only time I took advice and help from folks as I was navigating my career. And I have to say, I enjoyed the job. For various reasons, I left, but had there not been a few obstacles, I'd probably still be there. Now, that was case in point to the next one on here, which is I left jobs quite often without any plan in place. Whatever emotion, whatever was going on at the time, I let it get to me. And I have to tell you, you leave a job, you got bills to pay. You literally have to take the first one that comes along. It's very, very difficult, very, very awkward scenario. I know in 100 Devs, Lewis, you guys are talking about posting electronic resumes. Why don't you talk a little bit about this, and I'll delve in a little depth after that.
Okay.
So you guys have talked to Leon has chatted with you guys about what to do when you're posting electronically, correct?
Yes. Yeah. We post our our resumes or.
Okay, I think Lewis got stuck there. I hope he comes back. So there he is. We lost you for a second there, Lewis. All right, I'm gonna just jump. That's okay. I'm gonna just jump on this one. We'll let it go. I said mistakes and all. Okay. We might leave it in here. So what I'm talking about here is posting electronically. What I did, and I can vouch for the numbers. I posted thousands of resumes. I mean, 3, 4, 5,000 resumes on multiple systems. And the numbers I saw were, for every 1,000 that I would submit, I might get 20 callbacks and interviews. For every 100 or so interviews that I had, might get one offer, and there was no guarantee if I was even going to like that job. I was picking the first one at that point, okay? I wasn't tracking where I was applying, okay? And I think this is a critical piece, and I really haven't talked about that much in the coffee chats, but one of the things I do know in most industries is if they see people applying for a job multiple times, so if you've got a recruiter putting you in one company and a recruiter in another company, and you put in your own resume or any combination of those, you're probably going to get kicked right out of the system right there. Okay? What they see is, what the belief is that you're trying to game the system. You're trying to get better money from one or another or whatever. And they don't even want that kind of an attempt. Okay? So that tracking of where you applied and when and what job is critical. Okay? When recruiters are talking to you, hey, I got this great opportunity, I need to know the name of the company, I need to know the position because I want to make sure I haven't applied there. And they'll understand that, okay? They can contact that company on your behalf for that position and say, look, he's been applying a lot, he wanted to make sure he's not stepping on your toes doing this. Can we find out if he's already in your system or not, okay? The other phase of that, I think, is what I was trying to get you to here, Lewis, which is you've got to make it personal. I know one of the things that Leon had put out, and I've heard this through several of the 100 Devs members, is you post that message or you post that resume electronically. Make sure you're doing the follow-up with that company. It could be HR, it could be a recruiter. Contact them. Ask them if they received the resume. Make sure there's some contact in there. The personal connection can go even further. When you talk about networking and making sure you got folks that know you, and if you're filing electronically with a company and you've talked with 3 or 4 of the folks that work there, it makes life a whole lot easier, right? So did I miss anything on that one, Lewis? I kind of stepped over you there a little bit since you froze up.
No. I think you took the words right out of my mouth in terms of following up with the company. Leon said, if you just click apply, it's the equivalent of crumbling up your resume and throwing it away. Mm-hmm. Because everybody's doing that. Everybody's clicking the apply button and filling it up, and that's it. You know. But if you really want to stand out, yes, look for the recruiter of said company, maybe HR.
And I should point out that the numbers that I'm talking about, and the number of times that I applied electronically, this was upwards of 12 years ago plus. So there probably weren't as many people applying electronically then. So yeah, I would suspect today the numbers have risen quite a bit. So looking at the next one, interviewed and answered questions. I suspect I did reasonably well on most interviews. Now, realistically, I'm not perfect, and one of the things I want to point out as well here is your interviewer is not perfect either. Okay, I've had interviews where I answered everything correctly. I answered everything well. I was excited about what happened. I went back to, and now I've done this at Leading Edge where I work now. I'm going back to my parent company saying, look, I interviewed with this client and things went awesome. We're going to be hearing from them tomorrow. And we did. And tomorrow they said, yeah, Bob doesn't know anything about Angular. We don't need to hire him. Please don't send him over our way again. And what I realized through that is you can give the right answers. You can be the best candidate, but is it possible that it just hits that that interviewer the wrong way? Okay. I've had interviews of folks that I've asked questions of, and they gave me an answer, and every answer they gave me was the textbook, quote unquote, answer. Somebody with eidetic memory is the kind of person you'd be having give you that kind of an answer, and it's almost unnerving. I really have to dig in differently with that kind of an interviewee to determine if they really know what they're talking about or did they just memorize the answer. But the bigger problem here when I interviewed was I never asked them questions, and that's critical because that shows your interest in their company.
Exactly.
I think it's probably one of the most critical things you can do to take an average interview and make it better.
Yeah, to stand out a little more, you ask them questions. Now, do you know what questions are suitable for asking a company? Maybe because in my opinion, I do think there are some companies that you might be like overstepping your boundary, and I wonder if there are questions that are very professional.
Oh, sure. What I tell folks is, if they've got it on their website, it's probably fair game. Number one, okay. I usually tell folks when they're looking at companies to take anything you see positive about that company and turn it into a question. The example I use is the core values at Leading Edge. We have 5 core values. 4 of them are really easy. One of them has got a little bit of wiggle room, and that's do the right thing, not the right now thing. Okay, that could be taken several ways. What I should have asked, I didn't. What I should have asked was, what does that mean to you? Have the owners of the company ever explained what it means to them? And can you give me a concrete example of how your company applied that core value? And these are great questions. Now,
yeah.
I said at the beginning, there's a piece to preface there, which is anything you see positive. If you read an article that says that the company was hacked last year and their database was locked and they paid multiple millions to get it unlocked, I wouldn't be asking about that unless you're applying for a security position. Right?
True.
Okay. You can be smart about the kinds of questions, but pretty much anything on the website's fair game. What you're trying to do is show your interest in the company. If you've identified a pool of companies and you've got a smaller pool of companies that you're really interested in, those companies that you're not as interested in, that's where you practice. That's where you try out different questions. And you could even ask them after the fact. If they say, no, you're not good for the position, hey, can I ask a few questions here? I did ask some questions at the end like this and this and this. Do you think those are appropriate? Could they have been better somehow? Would there have been something that might have caught your interest a little bit more and maybe learn from that?
That's really good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Use those follow-ups. That's another piece in that, making it personal. This next bullet point. I did have a technical recruiter at one point that had contacted me, and he had me applying for a couple of positions. And clearly, I have a fairly monotone voice. I can put people to sleep fairly quick. When I worked in corrections, it was great for being a hostage.
Not for me.
Well, when I worked in corrections, it was great for being a hostage negotiator. You put people to sleep. That's a great thing, right? For interviewing, not so much. You know, I showed interest, or I should have shown interest, by asking questions. I didn't. Okay? This guy actually told me, he said, before you go to the interview, drink a couple of Mountain Dews. I took him at his word. And I remember that interview because I had to drive downtown Columbus. I had to go into this building. I was going up to like the, I don't know, 18th floor or something like that. Did the interview, came back out, and man, I got down to the bottom floor and I'm racing to the security desk. Where's the bathroom? Racing to the bathroom. 3 Mountain Dews before I got there. Yeah, I mean, I was probably bouncing off the walls and vibrating in the interview. I did get the job. I learned a few things there.
Hey, there it is.
Very uncomfortable way to learn things. But this last point here is an important one, I think, as well. When the job prior to the one I have now, I got hired on the second interview. Okay, not the second interview back to back. I interviewed. I didn't get the job. Okay. I didn't find out till many years later that I didn't get the job literally based on a coin flip. They had 2 people applying for that position. They were equally qualified, myself and one other individual. They flipped a coin.
Yeah.
Okay. I was the wrong side of the coin, apparently. They hired him. When he left, I had made friends with the HR manager, and we stayed in contact. It wasn't anything massive. It was, every 3-6 months, something like that. We'd send an email back and forth. And at one point, she sent me a message and said, look, he's leaving. Come reapply. I got the job the second time around. So my point there is that when an organization says no, it's probably rarely about you. Okay, you're not the perfect fit for that position. You might still be the perfect fit for that position, but they might have somebody else that's a little more perfect. Okay?
Yeah.
It's a no to that position, not a no to you. Okay?
And I think that's something very important to say because lots of people take rejection very personal without knowing the context of why they didn't get the position.
It's hard not to take it personal. I mean, what you've got to keep in mind is, in many cases, the further through the interview process you get, the more excited you're going to get. I'm going to get this. Somewhere in the back of your head, you've got this fear that you won't, but that excitement that you might, man, that's a powerful thing. We'd all much rather be happy than be sad, So, all right. So, that's my background interviewing. That's some of my lessons learned out of there. Okay. As we move forward into interviewer, these are my experiences. Okay. And I do want to preface that you're going to interview at other companies and you're going to see other experiences. One of the things that Lewis and I chatted about early on in this is I don't do tests. I don't have people code and things like that. You're going to have companies that want you to take a coding test. You're going to have companies that want you to whiteboard or whatever. I've heard of scenarios recently of folks that had to write code in front of somebody else. I've heard of scenarios of people writing code in front of somebody else, not being allowed to use Google. So what I pointed out to Lewis when I heard that one, when we were discussing this, is bear in mind that you're applying for a position. In my mind, if somebody asked me to write code without Google in front of them, I'm going to say when in the realm of that job, I was going to use foul language, I'll try not to. When in the realm of that work experience will I ever write code in front of you without the use of Google and be expected to do quality code? Okay, be realistic about this. I mean, yes, they are going to want to test a little bit. Part of what I have to point out is I interview a lot, but I interview mid and seniors. I interview very, very few junior level, entry level folks. Okay, my expectation is there's code in place, the things that they've had work experience. So companies that are hiring folks that don't have work experience are going to have slightly different requirements that I may not have met. So as we talk through this, kind of keep a little bit of that in mind, but I think most of this still applies. Okay. What I want to talk through is where I go from the beginning of the process. So I generally will get a resume from one of our recruiters at Edge. They tell me any goals or targets, things that they're looking for out of this interview. Okay, it could be they've been interviewed previously within our company because we do multiple steps, multiple interviews for each individual. And maybe that last tech interview they didn't get into something or they need a little more information on something, and I'm the one that digs a little more in depth and wraps up those points for us. I generally will review any previous information that any other interviewers have gathered on that individual, and then I take a look at the resume and the LinkedIn. Now, I'm not looking at these as critical as I normally would at this point. I'm reading through,
Okay.
and I'm keeping those goals and targets in mind as I read through. So if they were interviewed about front end and they talked a lot about Angular and they want to know about their React experience, I'm reading it specifically to see what they've done in React. Okay, I read through it as soon as I get it. Day of the interview, I read through it in the morning when my day first starts. Again, same thing, keeping those goals in mind as I go through. Then as I'm talking to that person, it's all fresh in my head. I've gone through it a couple of times. Okay. I do the same with the resume and with the LinkedIn, and I do kind of pay attention to things like is the language consistent and things like that. But I'm not as particular about how it's laid out and how it's organized at this point. So then when I start to interview, I have a set way of doing things. I suspect most interviews are going to be very similar. I start with a really simple one. Tell me about yourself. I'm looking for a summary. I'm looking for you to keep it relatively short. I've had folks that have gone on 10 minutes telling me about themselves, and that's okay. There's no right or wrong. Okay? But if you think about your resume, you do this little summary thing on your resume, you do it on LinkedIn, it's usually like 3 or 4 sentences long. Same kind of thing. Keep it short. Okay?
Yeah, and I think something that's important that Leon has said is to work on your story. Work on your to tell me about yourself. Give him a brief story of how you got to this point.
Yes, exactly. And that's important because they want to know what's important to you. Okay. Usually after that, I'm telling that individual what I'm looking for. I mean, there's no sense in hiding anything. This is not, it's not rocket science kind of stuff. I'm looking for X, Y, and Z because we didn't get that out of a previous interview, or I'm looking for ABC because we haven't interviewed you before. I'm the first round, and I'm front end, so I'm going to ask some specific questions within those categories. So I'm front end. I deal mostly with Angular, React, and JavaScript. If I'm talking Angular, I'm probably asking questions on observables and components and services, which are all basic things. And if you've spent a reasonable amount of time in Angular, you can talk to them. Whether you can give me a picture perfect answer or not, I'm not worried about. Just you can talk to them. Okay, we can have a discussion. React, state stores, moving data around that application. Basic stuff that most people that work with React should know how to do, right? I don't generally get into props and that kind of stuff with React because there are 2 different ways of doing it, and I tend to keep it a little higher level there. I don't necessarily need to dig into the weeds too deep there. With like JavaScript as a basic, I tend to stick to simple stuff like give me a difference between a for each loop and a standard for loop, and there are how many different ways to loop through an array in JavaScript. So there's lots of room to talk there on those. So pretty basic stuff that can give me a lot of information about you and how you work. What am I looking for as I have these discussions? I don't expect perfect answers. Number one. Okay? The 1 or 2 times I've had people give me word for word perfect answers, it makes me nervous. Okay? What I look for is some understanding that you might have gaps in your knowledge. Okay? And that you have a plan to fix it.
Yeah,
okay?
I think that's very important.
One of the things that I'll ask towards the end is, what do you know about unit tests? Because about 95% of the time, folks haven't done many unit tests. How many unit tests have you written? Not many. Now, in my mind, that's a bad answer. I mean, yes, you're clearly indicating you don't know what you don't know. And I expect people, nobody knows everything, right? I expect people to be open and honest about it. But a good answer is more along the lines of, I don't know much about unit tests because I haven't had a chance to write them. What I'm looking for is a company that understands the value of them and will let me learn how to write good unit tests. Okay? You've identified that gap. You've given me a plan to fix it. Okay? That's a self-awareness, and that's an important piece to what we talk about here. Okay? Now, in these next two pieces, we're going to dig in a little depth further on here, the team experience and code that you see on the list. Team experience, just going over these in surface. Here I'm talking to an individual and I want to know their experiences working in a sprint or in senior versus junior roles, code reviews, branching, naming variables, PRs, those kind of things, all those businessy kind of things. Okay. I often will get a lot of that out of the previous conversation. So it's where I haven't heard something that I'll make sure I fill in those gaps in my understanding of what you know or don't know. Okay. And in terms of code, I rarely look at code. I won't say never. Okay. And when I do look at code, I'll be looking at a portfolio. We'll talk a little bit about that, but the biggest part with a portfolio is it generic? Is it something that's custom? Can I see your passion for coding in what I see visually in front of me? Okay.
Yeah.
If I have to go further than that, I'm going into a repository. We talk things like code structure, folder structure, and that kind of stuff. How are we doing here, Lois? Any questions so far?
Yeah, I was gonna ask about the team experience. So, in terms of sprints, what's a question that you ask the interviewee about sprints?
Really simply, how often have you worked in a sprint? And, tell me about a sprint cycle and what kind of meetings and planning and organization you see in the sprints. It should be really easy.
What kind of answers are you looking for?
Just basic understanding. Sprints usually 2 weeks, and you have sprint plannings where you plan out the cards. Generally they're higher level 3 amigo meetings that some junior mid may not know about because they're not usually involved in those. You have retros where it's a follow-up. You have a day where you demo your code. Usually in the sprint each morning you have a 15-minute stand-up. I mean, if you've done it, this is something you're very familiar with. Okay. Conversationally, it's easy to get through that. Okay. All right, so let's dig into a little more depth. Okay, so I will apologize. Lewis dropped off at one point, and then the recording software completely failed on us. So we're starting up here again, talking about the alternate research. Having just ended up talking about these just kind of surface. But what I want to talk about here is on the portfolio. Usability and navigation is usually the first thing I'm looking at. How easy is it to navigate? When you click on things on the menu, does it slide cleanly? That kind of stuff. I'm not looking at anything fancy there, but one of the things I want to point out is that if I see those not being great, I'm going to dig in further. I'm going to dig in the next step. Because what I want to find out is what I'm looking for is to see where your passion is. Are you putting projects on there that you're passionate about? One of the examples I often give is there was an individual I was chatting with, and she was showing me the website she was building for her brother for his photography business. And I mean, this is something that she clearly cared about. I didn't have to look at the code to know that she wrote better code for that than she probably did for other projects. Okay, that care and concern showed. Okay.
Yeah.
One of the areas that I tend to run into things on when I'm chatting with folks and they're asking me questions about their portfolio is the skills. And people will put icons on there showing what their skills are. So, the GitHub icon, the JavaScript icon, that kind of stuff. And what I want to point out is recruiters don't know what those mean. We do. Developers do. People that use that software do. And this is not a slight on recruiters. Recruiters are very sharp and very good at what they do. Okay. But we've all seen the posts, the memes on, that job that's posted that they want 10 years of experience and then the tool's only been out for 3, or the guy that wrote the software that was told he didn't have enough experience with the software,
I remember that. I remember that post.
I mean, those kind of things happen. But my point is that recruiters don't know our jobs as well as we do. They know how to recruit. They're good people. They're trying to do their best. And sometimes they don't hit the mark. And expecting them to understand what an icon means might not be the best route. And I did come across somebody the other day that got it pretty close. I was asked to review a portfolio, and the icons were there. And I was hovering over, as I do, and I realized that they actually had the tooltip, the HTML tooltip, in place. But the HTML tooltip takes 1,000 milliseconds, about 1 second, to come up. And if you're moving fast with your mouse, you can almost miss it. I tell folks, go search how to do an HTML CSS tooltip. Okay, on W3 Schools, a site that I'm not the biggest fan of. That's a whole different video. They have a 1-line HTML and like 3 or 4 lines of CSS, and you get a tooltip. And it starts coming in immediately as you mouse over. So you get a quick visual. You know something's there. You're going to wait and find out that, hey, that's JavaScript, that's HTML, that's CSS. Okay? And then the last piece I want to talk about here is a personal photo. I hesitate to say professional photo because I'm not trying to tell people to go spend money. But, get a good photo in place. And be smart about it, too. The story I told, and I know Lewis laughed at this last time, and I'll probably laugh at it again. This individual has hair that was like really close in on one side and sticks way out on the other side. And very pretty, very nice looking young lady. But she centered the circle on the hair, and the whole website felt off center because of that. And, my thought was, get a professional photographer, get somebody to look at this and get their opinion on adjusting. And I'd rather chop the hair and have the face centered. It felt awkward as soon as I looked at it. And each of these takes you to that next level. And part of what I'm talking about here is this is a process. This is what I go through because I want to do the best job as an interviewer that I can. And I have, as I said at the beginning, I have certain targets and goals that I'm trying to achieve. And that's determining your knowledge base. That's determining your experience. That's determining how passionate you are. That's finding out about communication and that kind of stuff. And if I'm not getting it in the initial conversations, if I'm not getting it on the resume and on the LinkedIn, if I'm not getting it on your portfolio, each step I'm digging a little further in. Yeah. Okay? So on the portfolio, if some of these are off, I'm going to dig into even more. Am I going to look to see if the site's responsive? It's easy enough in the browser to turn the DevTools on and show it in a mobile view. Did you take enough time and effort to adjust it so it could be responsive? People tend to look on smaller devices these days. If this is, I think the term I used when you first questioned me was, is it bland? And you initially said, what does that mean? Okay, well, I think I've defined what bland means to this point. If the resume is bland, if the LinkedIn's bland, if the portfolio is bland, guess what I'm doing next? I'm going to go to the repository. Okay? My ultimate goal is not to go dig into your code and see how horrible you're a developer you are. My goal is to see where your passion is and how much care and concern you put in. So as I look at your repository, any developer who's been using GitHub, those kind of tools for a while can tell you, first thing you usually look at is branching. Because it's a quick number that shows right there. And if I see one that tells me that you probably push into main or master, you don't use a proper branching strategy the way most business does. Okay. Documentation. from there, I'll scroll down and look at the README. Is this a generic React project? Is this a generic Angular project? When you first install, they build a README. What I'm looking for is, did you add to it? Hey, what's the goal of your project? What kind of targets do you have for down the road past the MVP? What's your intent? If you put that stuff in, that shows care and concern.
Exactly. Even if you haven't done it yet.
Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, yeah. I mean, showing you intend to do something is just as good. It shows that awareness of a gap that you intend to fill. Okay. I tend to do a lot of pen and pencil sketches of my projects. Take a lot of notes, handwritten notes. I scan them in. I put them in the wiki on my repo, so it's all right there. I go look to see, what do you have in your wiki? If I'm not seeing that, next step I'm looking at is, are you using pull requests? So it's possible you've cleared out your branches so that number shows 1. That happens. But PRs, are you pushing PRs in? Are you using DevOps and that kind of stuff? There are all kinds of things you can find out just glancing at this thing. If I'm not seeing what I want there, then I'm going to dig deep into the code. Because the ultimate goal is I want to find out what kind of person you are, what kind of passions you have, what kind of code you write. If I can tell that from a conversation, I'd rather do it there. It saves me a lot of time. If you think about this, I mean, we've been talking for 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes or so on what I do to get from A to B, right?
But it's pretty interesting hearing that perspective, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a strong desire to dig into code, but when I do, what's the first thing you see when you see code is how is it laid out. You're seeing how it's organized in the folders. Doesn't have to match what I want. It just has to make some sense. Then when you look in those folders, you start to look at the code. Is the code laid out and clean and organized? When you have imports up at the top, are they alphabetical? Are they grouped in some way? Are there spaces in between those groups so that you can clearly tell what these pieces mean? Is your spacing good and clean and organized? If it's not, that tells me something about how you write code. Tells me something about how much you care or don't care about the project. Okay. If I'm not seeing good, clean, organized code, I realize I haven't even looked into the logic of the code yet. Guess where I'm going next? I'm going to start to read through your logic. Are you building something that's appropriate for the design? Are you making it overly complex or overly simplified?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't have to do any of this. I can leave it to just the bare interview. Okay. I do this, and I suspect a lot of developers that interview do, because we want to give folks a fair shake. Okay. Is it possible you gave me a good answer and I misinterpreted? Absolutely. That's why I take those extra steps to make sure. Okay, and that's why we have this whole talk in place. Okay, so final piece here is almost a summary. Not quite. What am I looking for as an interviewer? Okay. One of the things, the biggest thing is communication. I mean, we communicate all day long, meetings, out of meetings, pair programming, all this stuff. Your code itself is communication. Okay, so when I interview somebody, and I've got somebody in an interview, I get that we get nervous. I think I explained it earlier when I was talking to you and Shamir earlier, that, here you are bearing all of your experience and training and all of this and who you are to somebody you've never met before.
Exactly. You're telling somebody you've never met about yourself.
I mean, how is that not a stressful scenario? You know what I mean? So
I think for anybody.
In my mind, it's absolutely okay to say, hey, I'm nervous, I need help. If that company's not willing to help you, doesn't that say something about the company?
Exactly. Maybe that's not the right company for you. And there's nothing wrong with that.
I should point out here that developer skills are very, very low on this list. Okay? A basic communication of those skills is perfectly acceptable. I'm looking for a cultural fit. Okay, I've seen videos hours long on what culture means in a business, in an organization. But to me, it's really simple. Can I see myself working with you? Can I see myself sitting next to you, doing the job day in, day out? Okay, to me, that's cultural fit. Okay, self awareness, past, current, future. It's easy enough. What have you done in the past?
Definitely.
What are you doing now? How have you improved? And what's your plan for the next
Yeah,
stage
no
to
short
improve?
answers.
Yeah. Self review. Okay, I want to know that you can take a look at yourself and be critical about your own code without beating yourself up at the same time, because you're going to go through code reviews and those are painful enough. Um, I'll be honest, my first 8 years or so, code reviews were like the scariest thing I did. I had a lot of imposter syndrome because there was a huge gap between college and being a developer. I
Okay.
taught computers for 25 years in between. So here I am with a 25-year gap from college, becoming a developer again. And code reviews were terrifying. And I caught myself getting upset a number of times over code reviews before I realized that they weren't being critical of me. They were attempting to help improve the code I was writing for my client, just as I was supposed to do for them. Okay. Once you realize that, the imposter syndrome drops off pretty radically, and that's one that I need to be aware of when I'm interviewing. Okay, and then
I think
handling.
that's something very important. Yeah. Not to take things personal when it comes to a code review.
Mhm.
You know.
Let's be honest. Writing code is all about managing failure, right?
Of course.
I mean,
Yes.
that's what code. That's what we do when we write code. You write code, you expect it to fail.
And learning.
Yeah.
And learning from
So
that failure, in my opinion.
absolutely, yeah. So the next phase here is handling. How do you handle issues? How do you solve problems? And that ties right in with how do you handle interpersonal issues. And what I mean by interpersonal issues is, um, how do you deal with another individual when it becomes stressful? Um, I've told the story before of one of the individuals that I interviewed who was clipping his nails the entire time through the interview, which seems odd, but off screen, if your mic's off, it might be one thing, but this was clear, audible. I felt awkward about that one, and I wasn't 100% sure, and our company hired him. And believe it or not, he wound up working next to me for about 6 months. He was doing this on the job. Drove me absolutely insane hearing this thing just clip, 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 clip all the time. So interpersonal
You had a
issues, right?
front row concert seats.
We pushed my limits of being able to handle interpersonal issues on that one. We almost came to blows once or twice. He did eventually leave the company, and to this day, I'm happy about that one. I mean, he's not a bad guy, just it was a weird scenario. Okay.
Wasn't the right fit.
So that's something I kind of want to tease out in the conversations is how you handle issues, whether they're interpersonal or not. Sometimes I'll pull out the interpersonal because then I can hear some of the problem solving outside of code. Okay, it just shifts the
Now,
gears a little
would
bit.
you agree with me? I'm sorry to interrupt, but
Mm.
would you agree with me that that question with handling interpersonal issues and how to solve a problem, it goes back to your communication skills in
Mhm.
terms of not suffering in silence. As in, if there's a problem, you
Well,
communicate that with your team
I, I
so it doesn't get worse.
I agree with that.
Hmm.
I agree with it and I disagree with it at the same time.
Okay.
Okay, because with interpersonal, there's no 100% right answer.
True.
Okay,
True.
can there be scenarios where the right answer is turning around and walking away? There is no, in most of the questions that I ask, there isn't a right or wrong. I'm looking for thought process. Okay,
Got it.
your thought process right there was just fine. Okay,
Hmm.
But again, I want to reiterate here as we come to the end of this that developer skills was the last thing on the list.
Yeah.
I can verify those pretty easily. It's much harder to verify communication culture, self-awareness. I've got to verify in a way I can document it too. Because when somebody says, "Hey, why did you say we shouldn't hire this guy?" I got to have my ducks in a row to be able to answer that question. And I want to be fair to folks, so I am going to do a lot of research. I'm going to dig down deep if I have to. Make it easier on that recruiter, or on that interviewer, and set it up so they don't have to dig that far down if they don't need to. Okay, but the scenarios come up. One of the individuals in 100 Devs I was talking to a while back they had reached a point the recruiter I think it was wanted to see the portfolio, and whatever website you guys used for it was down for 2 hours right around his interview.
Oh my God.
So he couldn't show him the portfolio. So he said, "Okay, well, let's go look at the code." And he hadn't gone through my video yet on repos and that stuff, so it didn't go great. In fact, in talking with him, it was I think the interviewer had more of a problem with him than he had with the interviewer himself. So,
oh wow,
it can get there. Okay, it very clearly can, and if you're prepped and you're ready and you've thought about it, you'll be okay. So, having gone through all that, do you have any questions of me as we move forward here? Because here's our last slide, which is...
No, I mean, I think we covered it really well, and yeah, just try to stand out. Don't be shy. Reach out. You see a position, a job position that you apply for. Don't just stop there.
So
find a recruiter. Find somebody that works there.
The whole idea of this video is just to give you an insight to my side of the house. I am not the picture perfect interviewer. I have my way of doing things. Other interviewers may do it a different way. I'm not 100% sure, but
exactly.
I try and cover all the bases. So I'm hoping this gives you enough depth to be able to at least practice and learn and understand what it is you're seeing. They're not out to get you. That's probably one of the bigger ones. And I hope we showed that through this. Unless you got anything else, Lewis, I think we can call it at this point.
No, I think that's pretty much it. Thank you for having me.
Sure.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been an experience. Absolutely. All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Take care, everybody.